It's very nice. Okay, so Brother Ijaz Ahmed, feel free to take make a just an opening statement if you like, and let me know whenever you're ready to begin your 20-minute opening, inshallah.
So I want to say Bismillah assalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight. I do appreciate your presence here. Thank you, Stephen, for your wonderful opening statement. And thank you, Kenny, for being such a gracious host. I will try to move up so that you can hear me a bit more clearly. Brother Kenny, you may begin my time when ready.
Okay, brother, and you can begin now.
So the topic tonight is, was Christ crucified, with a focus on the historicity of the event. Keyword there is historicity. Please let me know in the chat if you can understand how quickly I am speaking. If you don't, please let me know and I will slow down. As a Muslim, I've been told all my life that there were mountains of evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus, the son of Miriam. I've been told that all historians agree that this event was an undisputed fact. Eventually, I decided to look up these claims and I found that they were not mountains, but rather sparse, non-contemporaneous claims primarily derived from a particular theological group's faith tradition. Some colleagues and I began live streaming on the EFDawah YouTube channel, and we quickly encountered a variety of Christians, apologists and scholars alike, who began to make statements which piqued our interest. This was an open forum. Any Christian could come on and give us the evidence for the crucifixion. Dr. Johnson McClatchy of Apologetics Academy argued that the historical testimonies of Flavius Josephus, Tacitus, and Lucian of Samosata were negligible as historical evidence. Dr. McClatchy further argued that the Gospels were the earliest historical evidence for the crucifixion, but also that the Gospel attributed to Mark, while being the earliest, was incomplete and had a lost ending of an undetermined length. Various other Christians argued that there was no smoking gun for the crucifixion. That person is Michael, and he is in the chat tonight, so he is contradicting himself, but rather a variety of cumulative evidences that support the idea of the crucifixion. To begin with, the Quran affirms that the death of Christ in history was made to appear this way. The clear Quran by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, which Stephen misquoted, says, "But they neither killed nor crucified him, it was only made to appear so." Curiously, the verse does not say that Allah made it appear so. The word shubbeha is an intransitive verb here. So there goes that argument, Stephen. It, referring to his death, was made to appear so. So, in other words, if we are to look at claims in history about the death of Jesus, we should expect to find that the records do say he was crucified. Therefore, if my interlocutor tonight was to claim that the Quran is in error, then this would not be a valid claim. For the Quran to be in error, it should say that the claim of the crucifixion in history does not exist. Since the opposite is the case, then the Quran is valid in what it says. For my interlocutor to argue against this passage of the Quran, he must therefore prove the claim that the Quran states the crucifixion of Jesus does not appear in historical sources. The Muslim has nothing to lose in this discussion, but rather everything to gain. Within the field of historiography, there is a subfield known as narratology. Professor John Gladys, a historian at Yale University, in his work, The Landscape of History, says on pages 47 and 48 about the sources which historians use. We interpret through our own distinctive viewpoints. It's here that imagination, even dramatization, is involved. Ultimately, though, the product must go before an audience, at which point one of several things may happen. The patrons may approve because what they see confirms their preconceptions. Pay attention to that, Stephen. They may disapprove if it does not. Muslims also pay attention. Or, and this is what paleontologists, tailors, and cartographers, as well as historians, hope for, the product may move those who encounter it to revise their own views so that a new basis for critical judgment emerges, perhaps even a new view of reality itself, end quote. You will notice here that the historian, despite using the terms critical judgment and a new view of reality, does not frame them within the context of being skeptical or hyper-skeptical. Rather, what can be gleaned is that in interpreting the past, asking questions is how they arrive at their conclusions. He emphasizes specifically that this is what encourages people to revise their own views. The question then becomes, between the Muslim and the Christian, who has more to lose if the crucifixion of Jesus is brought into historical doubt? As mentioned above, the Muslim's belief does not change and is not impacted. Historical sources claim he was crucified. This is present and appears to be the case in historical literature. This affirms what the Quran says. On the other hand, if the crucifixion narrative is brought into doubt, what does the Christian have to lose? Everything. So if the question tonight is one of bias or about determining who is arguing through necessity for the defense of one's faith, then it is not the Muslim who needs to account for their belief, but rather the Christian. The Christian stands to lose everything if the crucifixion is in doubt. Please keep this essential point in mind as we work through our dialogue. In the work, The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach, Dr. Michael Lacona mentions on page 105 that as a result, historians, especially those who study antiquity, speak of the probable truth of a theory rather than absolute certainty. In other words, when historians determine an event to have occurred historically, they do so on a scale of probability as opposed to one of absolute certainty. In the Sage Handbook of Historical Theory on page 211, it says, traditional history, Foucault points out, sees itself as neutral in terms of values, committed solely to the truth. Yet, in its will to knowledge, traditional history conceals what might be its own motives and desires. The genealogist, on the other hand, will openly admit his perspectives, his preferences in their controversy. He will attempt to understand his own motives and desires, fears and forebodings, his own situation within a specific historical context. The genealogist understands that the will to knowledge will never achieve universal truth. History can never achieve absolute knowledge, end quote. What then does it mean to be a historical fact? It means that an event at some time in history is considered to have been more probable to have occurred than less probable. If we were to apply a scale using a percentage at one end, we can have a 51% probability that an event happened to 49% that it did not. At the other end, we can have a 99% probability it did occur to 1% it did not. The reality, therefore, resides between 51% and 99% that an event could have happened. The error occurs when laymen hear the phrase historical fact and they associate this claim with one of absolution, when in fact it is to be considered within a range of probabilities. On page 17 of Professor Gladys's work, The Landscape of History, he says historians have always been, in this sense, abstractionists. The literal representation of reality is not their task, end quote. Tonight it may be asked of me, and it was, why do most historians agree that Jesus was crucified? The answer is simple. It's because they are basing their claim on the evidence which has survived, which they then interpret through the historical method and arrive at their conclusion. Professor Gladys further comments on page 41. He says, for historians too start with surviving structures, whether they be archives, artifacts, or even memories. They then deduce the processes that produced them, end quote. They can only start with what has survived. They then interpret this data and deduce a number of probable conclusions, which are supposed to be tested. Today, we are doing one such test. On page 26, he says, the historian's evidence is always incomplete. His perspective is always limited, and the thing itself is a vast expanding universe of particular events, ... End quote. At the time of Jesus, rebels were regularly crucified. Historians look for what they term continuities, meaning patterns that extend across time. Professor Gladys defines them on page 30 as phenomena that recur with sufficient regularity to make themselves apparent to us. Without such patterns, we'd have no basis for generalizing about human experience. End quote. Given that Jesus was identified as a rebel in Mark chapter 14, verse 48, and was meant to be crucified alongside another rebel, Jesus Barabbas in Mark chapter 15, verse 7, historians use this continuity of the regular trend of crucifixion to propose that Jesus probably died through this method by virtue of being a rebel. This is one reason which Professor Bart Ehrman mentions in his book, Did Jesus Exist? He says, when looking at the crucifixion, he says, the Romans crucified lots of people all the time. That is a continuity right there. Ironically, in Mark chapter 14, verse 48, Jesus rebuffs the arrest attempt by identifying himself as not a rebel. This places the Christian, like Stephen, in a very awkward position of having to agree with the historian based on the trend of the occurrence of the crucifixion for rebels as a proof for the crucifixion, while also disagreeing with Jesus himself, who vocalizes that he is not a rebel. Kenny, does that mean 10 minutes left?
Yes, brother.
Thank you. The idea then is that historians have decided that Jesus was more likely than less likely to be crucified because the Romans routinely crucified people. The historical method, however, accounts for events which happen outside of the norm of continuities. Professor Gladys says in page 31 that they can involve what the chaos theorists call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, situations where an imperceptible shift at the beginning of a process can produce enormous changes at the end of it. They may result from the intersection of two or more continuities. Students of accidents know that when predictable processes come together in unprecedented ways, unpredictable consequences can follow. What all of these phenomena have in common is that they don't fall within the realm of repeated and therefore familiar experience. We generally learn about them only after they've happened. End quote. In other words, as Professor Gladys states on page 45, newly discovered evidence has to be compared with what's already known, end quote. By using this new evidence, we can also look at what Dr. Gary Habermas states in his work, The Historical Jesus, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Christ. On page 44, he references the use of the negative evidence principle. The principle is defined as when all the available evidence used to support the view that P is true is shown to be inadequate. End quote. In sum, if we have new evidence, that is new data, and if this new data allows us to reinterpret the original hypothesis against the current evidences, and if this data impacts the strength of these evidences, then our hypothesis must change. The probability of the hypothesis in our case that Jesus was crucified is allowed not only to be questioned, but more so determined not to be as probable as previously claimed when the new data is taken into consideration. In Did Jesus Exist? Professor Ehrman writes, to establish the historical probability of a saying, deed, or experience of Jesus, we want a large number of independent sources that can be shown not to be incorporating their own biases in the account in question, and that corroborate one another's report without showing any evidence of collaboration. And the closer these sources are in time to the events they narrate, the better, end quote. Modern scholarship accepts that while the New Testament's gospel accounts are the earliest surviving traditions about Jesus, they are not independent of each other, and they do actively attempt through editing and harmonization to corroborate what the other gospels say. Professor Philip Comfort, in his New Testament text and translation commentary, gives dozens of examples where harmonization has occurred throughout the New Testament. Dr. Timothy Mitchell, in citing James Royce and Ernest Caldwell, says that they both recognize a tendency to harmonize readings with remote parallels in other gospels, end quote. The text tradition of the gospels then don't merely harmonize their details in common stories, but also in stories which have little to do with each other. In the previous UBS Greek New Testament editions, they contained ratings for the variants in the text for the level of confidence that the textual critics had in their choices. 59% of these variants were chosen with difficulty and great difficulty in regards to their certainty. Only 8.9% of these variants reached the highest level of certainty itself. In patristic and text critical studies, the collected essays of William L. Peterson on page 410, it stated that our critical editions do not present us with a text that was current in the year 150, 120, or 100, much less in 80 CE, end quote. This means that the tradition of the Gospels is not as early as is usually assumed. Roy Kotansky, in his work entitled The Early Papyri, Gospel Parallel Variants and the Text of the New Testament in the second century, which was published in Scribes and Their Remains, as edited by Professor Craig Evans and Jeremiah Johnson, argues convincingly that one can persuasively argue that the earliest period of the gospel text was not firmly fixed, but rather represented the product of much interpretive rewriting of tradition, end quote. He further states that this is Roy Kotansky. He further states that Helmut Koster reminds us that whatever the consequences, the first 100 years from the time of writing of the gospel autographs to the appearance of their initial papyrological record in the period of circa 200 CE represented a span when substantial revisions were not only possible, but highly likely, end quote. Historians then are doing the best they can with non-independent, edited, revised, reinterpreted, rewritten traditions spanning from the earliest period of the text of the Gospels. They can only realistically, as stated previously, make a decision based on what has survived, even with its severe and multiple defects. It is noteworthy that if the earlier sources preferred, then the Q document, which predates the Gospels entirely and which is based on the oral tradition, does not have Jesus predicting his death, dying a cross, or even being resurrected. Professor Dale Allison Jr. writes in his Jesus of Nazareth, Millenarian Prophet, on page 59, on the one hand, traditions that originated with Jesus were reformulated, translated, modified through additions, and given new meaning through secondary context, end quote. What then about the other criteria which scholars use to judge the historical Jesus? Embarrassment, discontinuity, and coherence. Professor Dale Allison Jr. writes in The Historical Christ and the Theological Jesus that a historian's Jesus is never just the consequences of reading sources through a screen of criteria. Rather, we conduct our intellectual rituals, that is, invent and or apply our criteria only after we have adopted some firm ideas about Jesus. Our criteria are less routes to our destination than ways of persuading others to end up where we have, end quote. Professor Dale says in the book again, Jesus of Nazareth, he remarks on page 2 that these criteria appeal to common sense, end quote. But he then says, reflection, however, creates more than a little unease. Coherence, for example, is a rather subjective thing. Two things that fit together according to one exegete may seem irreconcilable to another, end quote. On page 3, the issue is not whether we can find tensions, but whether they mean much. Consistency and inconsistency are very much in the eye of the beholder, end quote. And on page 4, the criterion of dissimilarity, whose implicit notion that the new is good may be the offspring of the modern idea of progress, is no less troublesome than the criterion of consistency. As others have remarked, it can at best tell us what was distinctive, not what was characteristic of Jesus, end quote. He then says, all too often, however, this similarity has been misused as a means of separating the authentic from the inauthentic. That is, a way of eliminating items from the corpus of authentic materials, end quote. He says on page 5, beyond this, the objection of Morna Hooker, first raised 3 decades ago, this book was written in 1998, has never been successfully answered. We just do not know enough about first century Judaism or early Christianity to make the criterion very reliable, end quote. Finally, he says on page 6, whether or not one shares my misgivings about dissimilarity, coherence, and embarrassment, it is certain that they and other criteria have not led us into the promised land of scholarly consensus. If our tools were designated to overcome subjectivity and bring order to our discipline, then they have failed, end quote. And on page 7, apparently we must reconcile ourselves to the unhappy fact that our methods are defective and may often mislead us, end quote. As for the method I'm employing tonight, I am not making a new claim or a different one. Rather, I'm saying that it makes sense why the historians arrived at the conclusion they did, and I affirm that, as they say, these evidences have severe problems and issues which devalue the probability that the crucifixion occurred. In this sense, I have adopted, as Dr. Locona defines, methodical neutrality. In this method, I have looked at the claims and evidences that those who affirm the view that Jesus was crucified and found them to be applicable to the negative evidence principle as stated by Dr. Habermas. My interlocutor tonight presumes the Gospels are true and its message reliable, and so he has adopted methodical credulity, which bears the burden of proof. I am not offering a new hypothesis, but rather examining the current one on its own merits as advocated by those who accept it as true. That the gospel versions of events are the only narratives to survive do not necessitate that they are the best versions of what actually happened, or that they are the only narratives to have existed at all. Thank you.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. And that was 20 minutes.
Almost on time.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Great job. Great job, brother. Okay. All right. So, Stephen, whenever you're ready, let me reset the timer for the 10-minute first rebuttal.
Okay, just give me a moment.